Good morning. Glad you could all be here. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I do so with the hope that you can help fix the challenged world that earlier generations, including mine, have left you. I apologize for that. I will try in this talk this morning to bring light on how we got to this point and how we might move forward. I can hope it can help your own thinking and your own efforts. My analysis, I should point out, is assiduously apolitical. I do that for two reasons. First, the anti-democratic trends that we see around the world are not specific to a particular point of view. They are driven by extremes across the spectrum of political and societal beliefs. Second, I do not see a solution to our divided society through partisan media. That's a winner-take-all proposition I would rather avoid. We are here because we believe in free press. We are here because we believe in free expression. We are here because we believe in democracy. We believe in a society that can and should tolerate its differences and reach consensus on how we live together. We believe in all of those things. It turns out there's a paradox in that. History tells us ever more loudly that the greater the freedom of expression, the greater the fragmentation of perspectives, the greater the difficulty to achieve consensus, and thus the greater the difficulty for a democracy to flourish. Our society is fractured. Societies around the world are fractured. There are deep fissures of ethnic, religious, and economic conflict. We are in a crisis of divisiveness driven by fear of the other, by fear of the future. Some fears are justified, others are stoked for political gain. We demonize those we disagree with. We see them as the other. We portray and perceive them through simplistic accusatory memes. In doing so, we deepen the divide, we do not bridge it. We see a democracy that's not holding up to its promise. We see less willingness to engage in constructive dialogue. According to Pew, trust in government has declined from nearly 80% in the early 1960s to 20% today. More troubling, less than 20% of Americans think democracy is a good model for other countries to follow. Think about that. How did we get here? Are the challenges specific to our contemporary digital world? Are they the result of a longer trend? What has caused so many to believe democracy has failed them? Can democracies survive our modern digital age? Can democracies survive the internet? Democracies live or die on our ability to find common ground, to grow a shared consciousness, to consider complex issues and find compromise. Democracies break down when the motivation to achieve compromise is lost. It did not start with the internet, though the internet did certainly exacerbate that trend. At every stage of the evolution of communications technology, from the printing press to electronic media to the internet itself, there have been disruptions. As communications technology made it easier for people to express themselves, it has enabled more different points of view and, as a result, more conflict. Gutenberg's printing press was as disruptive in its time as we might see the internet today. Yes, it broadened access to information, but it also challenged the dominant institutions of the day, whether they be the government or the church. The religious tracts of Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church and triggered the Reformation. Like the internet, the printing press brought tremendous benefit of shared knowledge. Without the printing press, we would not have had the shared technical knowledge that spurred the Industrial Revolution. But like the internet, it was as capable of spreading falsehoods as it was of spreading fact-based knowledge. Among the early printed tracts were religion-infused diatribes against the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim world. There has never been a golden era of truth. With every progression in communications, there is an expansion of voices, a fragmentation of beliefs, and an increase in both the intensity and volume of conflicting perspectives. The printing press was only the start. The modern era of electronic communication had an exponential impact on how our society operates, particularly television, and then the internet. 75 years ago, the media ecosystem of the United States was an oligopoly of a few large media outlets, 3 commercial networks, public broadcasting, and a few influential newspapers. They offered a selective and incomplete view of our society. Some say that homogenized view had its benefits, though voices at the margins, whether extreme or simply unheard, were largely out of view. Marginalized voices were shunted to the unlit corners of our culture, to the small circles of a printed newsletter or a niche magazine. It was, in the eyes of some, the heyday of trusted mass media, of Uncle Walter Cronkite and CBS News. It is a matter of opinion whether it presented a true sense of our country's collective psyche or was only a gauze hiding underlying cultural factors. 50 years ago, cable and satellite networks fragmented the media environment further, introducing hundreds of channels of news and entertainment. Over time, it spawned more partisan news outlets, each seeking to attach themselves to a loyal target audience in a competitive marketplace. This marked a substantial progression in the fragmentation of our society, a troubling shift towards silos of belief. The left-leaning news brand is despised by the right-leaning news brand is despised by the left. Both lean toward affirmation rather than information, with fact-based coverage being drowned in a flood of opinion or skewed through the lens of political bias. 30 years ago, the internet fragmented the ecosystem further and exponentially. The internet broke the information space into 1 million shards, from 500 channels to more than 1 billion voices. It allowed many to feel heard and others to find the information and beliefs that reflect their view of the world. As a society's access to media became more open, the information space became intrinsically more diverse and mathematically more divisive. We can choose and do choose the voices that reflect our view of the world, the voices that reflect and confirm our biases, good, bad, or indifferent. We are left with a divided society that resists consensus. Our politicians focus on their core supporters with little inclination to seek compromise or accept a common set of facts. They define and contrast themselves with those they disagree with against those they despise. Compromise is off the table. Plato's prediction that free expression would doom democracy to the appeal of the simple dictates of an authoritarian seem uncomfortably valid. Plato understood the paradox that a society with unrestricted freedom of expression is more susceptible to the hard-fisted demagogue who preaches a simple path forward while spreading misinformation, inciting hatred, and undermining democratic values. Sound familiar? Where do we go from here? Some hope we can address the challenges of our information ecosystem through public policy, whether to address misinformation or copyright or privacy or cybersecurity. The global policy research organization, the Center for News, Technology, and Information, upon whose board I sit with Marty Barron and Maria Ressa, provides objective analysis of policy approaches from around the world that might affect the free press and the open internet. The challenge is that many of these policies can impact the very frameworks of free expression and of free press itself, particularly those related to fake news, content moderation, misinformation, disinformation. Yes, the internet has elevated both noble speech, which appeals to our better angels, and heinous speech, where outrage and self-righteousness can foment a blind hatred of others. This bothers us, as it should. We demand it be fixed, but how? Supporting free expression requires tolerating speech we may find disagreeable, even heinous. How do we define acceptable versus unacceptable speech? Managing free expression in a free and open society is a contradiction in terms. Too often today, many people believe in free expression only to the extent it's acceptable and agreeable to them. That's a problem. Therefore, we must think carefully about asking governments to define free expression in a politically conflicted world, left versus right, one side in power today, the other tomorrow. How can boundaries on expression be crafted when problematic speech also comes from politicians and media? Since the political sphere spins in the atmosphere of media, we should not expect rigorous definitions of fact versus fiction, of what is awful versus lawful. What speech do we disallow? What guidance do we give platforms of communications and amplification? What form of fake news policy is not potentially a tool to be misused by others in power? To what extent do such mechanisms raise the possibility of one-sided dominance versus broad discourse? I'm not suggesting there is no need for smart policy. However, public policy offers no silver bullets to address the challenges we face. We must, in the journalism community, look at our own efforts. Let's consider how we in the media might address the challenge. Let's consider approaches to journalism that might guide our societies toward consensus versus divisiveness. Let's rethink the models of trustworthiness. Let's rethink the role of an evolved journalistic entity in strengthening a community. Let's rethink models of civic engagement that might help in tackling the challenging issues of our day. Let's consider the question of trust. We often say we must build trust in journalism, but saying we should generally trust in journalism is akin to suggesting we should generally trust politicians or used car salespeople. Pew Research tells us all of those professions have very low ratings of trustworthiness. Journalism is not monolithic. It has many variations in quality, in approach, and in degree of partisanship. We may speak thoughtfully of journalistic ethics, but we must acknowledge that acceptance of those principles and adherence to those ethics is neither comprehensive nor consistent. There are no applicable laws, nor should they be, in a world that respects free expression. Our challenge is to evolve or create journalistic organizations that can bridge the gap of divisiveness and create frameworks that might better lead to consensus. That means striving to gain respect from across the political spectrum. Building trust with a partisan cohort, with a partisan audience, eager to hear the confirmation of their biases, is easy. That's not trust. That's affinity. That's blind loyalty. Building trust across chasms of divisiveness is hard. That's called respect. In this context, I am not a fan of partisan news organizations. By definition, a partisan outlet is aligned with a specific political movement or point of view. In addressing divisiveness and guiding toward consensus, partisanship can be a roadblock, not a solution. My preferred definition of journalism is to give people the tools and information they need to be good citizens. It is not to tell people what to think, but to give them the information they need to draw their own conclusions. My ideal motto would be one that strives for objectivity. We inform, you decide. Some question, how can we be objective in such a challenged partisan world? Objectivity is not about one's beliefs. Rather, it is a rigorous process of critical thinking that pursues facts accurately and fairly, regardless of whether they align with one's personal beliefs or political agenda. As Marty Baron suggests in his superb book, Collisions of Power, we should expect journalists to be objective just as journalists demand that police and judges be objective. It's a process, it's a discipline. In the world of media, trust must be constantly re-earned. Recently, a thoughtful graduate student at Stanford suggested we borrow from philosophy. She said, let's consider the framework of epistemic arrogance versus epistemic humility. Perhaps we should frame the contrast between journalists who assume they are trusted because of their profession, that would be epistemic arrogance, and those who recognize the need to interrogate their own credibility and methods, which is epistemic humility. How do people develop trust in sources of information? There are several vectors. First, we trust people we know and those endorsed by people we know. It's a social construct, good, bad, or indifferent. We trust people who are more like us in one way or another. We are tribal. If the head of the tribe says the moon is green, I'll say yes. To be sure, I get a leg of the calf at dinner that night. Trust is a social construct, first and foremost. Second, people put trust in institutions, the church, a government, a charismatic leader, a specific news source. But trust in institutions can deteriorate and shift, as we are seeing. Third, through what we call information architecture. Academic and scientific journals are more trusted because of the reinforcing information architecture they provide. Each article features a fact-based narrative, footnoting, data transparency, and a peer review. Wikipedia, like encyclopedias before it, has a rigid architecture of referencing and a refined approach to a fact-based narrative. These architectures evolved over time to address challenges of veracity and trust. They explain an entity's purpose and principles and objectives through the very structure of the work. Maybe we should consider whether the information architecture of legacy journalism is serving today's mission. At the macro level, the information architecture of a news brand like the New York Times or the Washington Post features a mix of fact-based journalism surrounded by ever more opinion. Some news brands continue to make political endorsements. This architecture of objective fact-based journalism here, packaged with partisan expression over here, seems rather counterproductive. We cannot expect broad-based trust in fact-based journalism if it is surrounded by opinion pieces that suggest otherwise. We see this in the research. This isn't a theory. Let's rethink the information architecture of the article itself, of the atomic unit of fact-based journalism, to better reinforce the factual nature of the work, to reduce the perception of bias, and respect the audience we think should respect us. Let's also consider our language. Janet Coates is a linguistics researcher and managing director of the Consortium on Trust in Media and Technology at the University of Florida. Her research on the coverage of the George Floyd protests found the verbs used to describe protest actions repeatedly drew comparisons to fire or destruction, such as spark, fuel, erupt, trigger, ignite. Professor Coates poses the question, is the recurrent use of this fiery language a deliberate choice, or is it a subconscious pattern when covering such stories? What impact does that have on the perception of political demonstrations and of the people participating in them? How might that fuel the partisan divide? Language matters. Linguistics matters. Politicians know this. They spend lavishly on message testing to understand precisely which words and phrases will stimulate the desired response, be it hope or fear. We, in the world of journalism, must also study linguistics. We should assess the impacts of the terms and phrases we use. We must consider the impact of amplifying the false memes and spin propagated by the politicians we cover. We live in a landscape of distorted risk. We often vote with unfounded fears of terrorism, crime, or whatever ills the body politic is inclined to make us fear. We fear terrorism despite the fact we are 11,000 times more likely to die of heart disease in the United States. We fear crime when we are 28 times more likely to die in a car accident. Errors in context in news coverage can be more dangerous than errors in fact. The lack of context may be an unconscious oversight in the blur of breaking news. It bleeds, it leads, as we like to say. However, there's also a degree of fear-mongering when we cover such stories, in some cases. Either way, incautious coverage, absent of fact-based context, is a form of misinformation. We need to close the gap between irrational and rational fear. We must provide more thoughtful context, and we do have the tools to make it easier for us to do that today. I recently revisited the work of Robert Putnam. Putnam has researched the connection between effective governance and community engagement for 5 decades. He began his work in Italy, which in 1975 shifted power from the central government to the provinces. He found that the strongest corollary with effective governance was community engagement. Basically, people in regions of ineffective governance were not joining clubs. They weren't going on picnics or joining bowling leagues. They weren't getting to know people who were different from them. They weren't building a shared reality. They weren't building social capital. This is a result of many factors, and he's continued this research through the day. If anything, it's more true now than it ever was. It's the result of many factors: the rise of television, increased suburbanization, the impact of technology, and certainly the internet. All right? Without community and real-world social engagement, we are not exposed to the diversity of our communities. We lose the opportunity to understand the challenges and the attributes of people who are not like us. If we don't engage with the other, with those who are not like us, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, no matter where you are in a society, we become more vulnerable to perceiving the other from an isolated, removed silo of fear. Our greatest opportunity in building a future for journalism would be to strengthen the communities we serve. It's at the community level, by rethinking the role of community news organizations as a community platform suited to our modern digital world. First, its explicit mission would be just that, to strengthen the community, to both address the community's information needs and create opportunities for engagement. In seeking to bring the diversity of a community together, it would also strive to be assiduously apolitical. Again, we inform, you decide. Second, it would celebrate the community's hopes and dreams, giving focus to its successes, to examples of civic empathy, as well as being the watchdog for misbehavior. You can't just be the town scold. You have to show people that you also believe in that community and how to make it better. It would purposely address the community's broad information needs. Community events, local sports, the progression of life from birth to obituary. It would leverage topics of community interest that aren't controversial. A recent mega-study coordinated by Stanford University determined that the best method of addressing divisiveness is to engage the community initially on non-controversial topics. This can help unify a community and build the trust necessary to address the more difficult topics. We see accountability journalism as the priority. To ferret out corruption, to expose criminal behavior, it's critical, and it should be the priority. But we should also understand that the audience for serious accountability journalism is small, in the low single digits. By addressing a community's comprehensive information needs with what we call service journalism, we can provide value to the community and gain exponentially higher engagement. People are not surprisingly more interested in high school sports than they are in city council coverage. This both drives the business model and increases the impact of accountability journalism by exposing it to those who would not seek it out. Last, it would seek any and all methods to drive the community to engage with each other, both virtually and in the real world. Might the 60-year decline in social engagement, which Putnam reports, be addressed by renewed approaches to local media? Can we recast local news as an engagement architecture that helps enable a shared consciousness that helps build social capital? What I've outlined is not just an idea. There are organizations that are implementing and succeeding with such models. I see Cityside in several communities in California. I see City News in Italy. Another is a publisher in Canada called Village Media, which has established itself in nearly 30 communities ranging from Sault Ste. Marie to downtown Toronto. And I should point out, I'm on their board because I so believe in what they're trying to do. Village has proven that such models can be both self-sustaining and indeed profitable, and without a subscription paywall. It has recognized the value of advertising both as a source of merchant information in a community and as the lifeblood of the local economy. While the digital ad markets are extraordinarily effective at connecting, say, a custom furniture business with customers in far-flung markets, the community platform can address the needs of local organizations and businesses to communicate with the communities they serve. Local news may never be the license to print money that it once was, or once claimed to be, but it can be a viable, sustainable, and influential business in a community. Village Media is innovating further with a community social network called Spaces. It enables members to connect on carefully curated topics of community interest. You might think of it as a carefully programmed and moderated next door. To shift away from toxicity toward civility, Spaces emphasizes non-controversial topics. Yes, let's create a space for local skiing and backcountry hiking. No to the neighborhood watch where a dark hoodie is seen as an intrinsic source of fear. Spaces looks to build connections between virtual discussion and real-world engagement. The local brew pub can host the monthly meetups of the local woodworking group. The local YMCA can host a space for their members. Build social capital. The objectives stimulate that community engagement that Robert Putnam shows is so important to effective governance. Let's take this a step further. Might we try new models of consensus building? Lawrence Lessig notes that democracies were not always electoral. Indeed, there is a body of thought from Montesquieu, Rousseau, and others that models of electoral representation have their weaknesses. In a polarized world, they can lead towards autocracy and away from democracy, or what Alexis de Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority. Sound familiar? That seems plausible in a modern we versus them political environment of forever campaigning and unlimited financial contributions. An alternate approach used in Athens and in the French republics was something called sortition. These were randomly selected citizen assemblies that deliberated on the challenging questions of the times. While not perfect, they were more representative of a society's diversity and less distorted by contemporary electoral politics. There are compelling efforts in Europe, like the Bürgerrat Demokratie in Germany, and the citizen assemblies of Ireland to collaborate on complex issues such as same-sex marriage and climate change. Might such models of deliberative consensus be useful today, if only as a supplement to representative democracies? Let's take the idea of citizen assemblies and map it against a community engagement platform like Village Media Spaces. Might that framework, along with a greater degree of community trust, support the hosting of virtual and real-world assemblies on the more challenging topics a community faces? Can that be the role of a community media organization as well? The answers to our challenges are complex and nuanced. I don't want to suggest otherwise. There are answers if we step back and rethink the models from every dimension. The answers will require thoughtful leaders in every sector, media, technology, academia, and politics, to be role models, leaders who are with a more principled view of the common good, leaders who can drive consensus about what is the common good. Changing the nature of societal engagement will require the leadership of many. It cannot and will not be solved by any singular action. As troubled as we may be about the state of our world, it is critical we make every effort to identify and advance thoughtful solutions, whether small or big, whether simple or audacious. I close with a few specific recommendations, and I thank you for your attention. First of all, as you do your work, understand the information needs of your audience. Ask them. Don't just assume. Understand your audience's evaluation of your performance. Ask them. Don't just assume. Be intentional in considering how you gain trust through policy, through tone, through language, through information architecture. Explore new forms and content models that can achieve trust and that can work with ongoing changes in media behavior. How do we do that kind of trusted and trustworthy journalism on TikTok, for that matter? Experiment with how you might lead your community, whether a town or a student body, to engage and find consensus on an important issue. Can you spearhead that effort? I do have confidence in our future. There are constructive paths forward. There are workable solutions. We need to push them as far as they can go. As leaders in our domains, whether me or you, whether the head of a big company or the editor of a high school newspaper, it is critical we identify constructive paths forward. It is critical we lead with all the optimism and passion we can muster. And I thank you in advance for all the efforts I know you'll bring to this. Thank you. I think I'll be joined up here.
We have some time for questions. If anybody wants to ask a question, there are microphones in the back. Come on, you're a room of journalists. The white sweater. Go ahead.
I know you mentioned you have this model that we observe and you decide. So how do you implement that into your work?
Well, at Google, and as noted earlier, I'm no longer the head of news globally at Google, but the way we approach things with our algorithmic work was basically to be very clear that in surfacing, for instance, search results on any particular news story, that we had no editorial point of view, right? That wasn't our job. Our job was to do our best to surface a diversity of perspectives, no matter what the subject was. But we also sought in a lot of our work to, what I was most proud of is, could we not only understand the full nature and dimensions of a story algorithmically, But could we do a better job of trying to address the variable information or knowledge that the user had, right? I mean, some people come to it and they've been following the story, others haven't. So we would also look at, well, here's the latest coverage. We would also make sure the opinion content was distinctly separate. And then we'd say if we could find an explainer on the issue to surface it, or an interview with a key participant to surface it. So, as I said, I believe that my favorite definition of journalism is providing the tools and information that citizens need. And that was the same philosophy I took when I was doing that work at Google. How could we didn't create the news, but how could we present to you the tools and information that might help you be an informed citizen? That was how we took it. We inform, you decide.
I know you answered some of this in your last question. I was also wondering, what is your personal favorite strategy to create community engagement and decrease division at Google?
Well, at Google in this regard, it's obviously, well, here's how we do it. I mean, what we did it in my own work was, as I said, a large part of my work was not just how we present news on Google, it was how do we work with the ecosystem. And I don't suggest that we had all the answers or have all the answers. But what we did try to do, and I think over 10 years, I spent something like $1 billion of Google's money trying to drive innovation in the space and try to, just what could we do to have people step back? I've been saying for a long time, we need to step back and rethink every dimension of journalism and how we operate today. And that's not to suggest that everything needs to change. It is to recognize that the world around us has changed, our behaviors as citizens and consumers of content have changed, and we need to step back and say, well, given all of that, how do we do this stuff differently? Right? I'm not suggesting the principles change or the ethics change. But if our job is indeed to serve the information needs of a community, then it is our job also to figure out how do we do that in a better way to bring communities together.
Of course. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Miller. And while you were working at Google, I was just wondering what strategies did you employ that led your employees to be more influenced, and how did that change productivity within your company?
Well, it was, I have to say my 15 years at Google were as fascinating as any period in my career. These are extremely thoughtful people, very smart people. I have tremendous regard for them. Interestingly, in the news space, and doing what I did in the news space, I worked largely with engineers, right? With people who knew how to craft algorithms, who did not necessarily understand the world of journalism, right? So I spent a lot of my time, given that's my background, spent a lot of time working with them to help them simply understand the nature of how journalism works and operates. On the other hand, once they got there, I remember one of the first people I met when I joined Google was Krishna Bharat, who was the inventor of Google News, right? And his whole objective, and it was done in the shadow of 9/11, he said, this is a complex global issue, and I want to see what other people are saying around the world about this issue, right? But his work just stunned me because he was just taking a computational approach to understanding the architecture of news and how to piece it apart and how to present it. And I learned a ton from that. So it was both sides. It was, how could they in their work illuminate my understanding of what we could possibly do in my own efforts to say, here's how journalism works, here are the things we need to be careful and thoughtful about, including not taking an editorial position. Google can't, as a company with billions of users, take a side. It doesn't work. But that's what we tried to do. That's what I tried to do.
A brief follow-up question. If you had to pick a single journalist to be your role model or anyone just in that field, who would it be and why?
I would veer towards people like Marty Baron. I adore Marty. He's brilliant. He's thoughtful. He has as profoundly an adherence to fact-based journalism as anyone I know. I would be at dinners with him, and if a political subject came up, he'd basically back out of the room, right? Because that's not how he saw his role. I did, however, ask him once, I said, given your fierce belief in fact-based journalism, how are you comfortable with the fact that your work is surrounded by so much opinion? And he gave me a very honest answer. Didn't solve it, but he gave me a very honest answer. He said, one, it's very popular, confirmation bias. And second, it doesn't report to me, because at the Washington Post, opinion and editorial reports to the publisher, not to Marty. But Marty Barron is one, very innovative in the digital space. David Wamsley, editor of the Globe and Mail in Canada, also brilliant at digging deep and understanding the architecture of journalism and how to evolve it. I'm sure I'd come up with more names, but those are the two that popped to my mind. As particularly from the standpoint, I mean, obviously I know a lot of great journalists and a lot of really brave journalists, Maria Ressa being one of them. But what I'm really keen on are those who are willing to step back. And that's basically what I'm asking you, is to step back. You know, I think of myself in a sense more as an architect. I don't mean in a, you know, is how do you deconstruct the matrix of the information space and our role in the information space, and then look to piece it back together in a way that might make more sense in today's world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. Is this the last question?
I think it is.
All right.
I'll try to make a short answer, and maybe that'll accommodate one more question.
All right. So I think your point about having like local and community news be a solution for like the divisive nationwide nature of news is very interesting. But you also mentioned stuff like Village Media, I think you said was in 30 cities. Do you think there's any contradiction or conflict between having a big corporation be involved in the solution of having a bunch of community networks for news?
I honestly don't think it's, I have no opposition to the notion of a big corporation doing that. It's all about the vision, right? If you're, I mean, and we've discussed this at Village, saying like, suppose we have 1,000 cities, how does it change, right? What shouldn't change is, do I have a deep respect for how that operates in that community? Is the leadership of that organization in that community, right? And that's what used to be the case. But then as big chains developed in the United States, it became all about how do we increase the margin, right? You know, Gannett newspapers, USA Today, how do I increase the margin? And they would just skinny down the local efforts. In many cases, wouldn't even have a publisher who lived in the community. So obviously, in any, you know, again, I work at Google, which I think is a very principled company. But there is always that balance between how do you make sure to maintain the principles and maintain the business and not let one overwhelm the other. But I cannot say, it would be dishonest and I don't think accurate for me to say this can only be local community-owned publications. That would be great. And frankly, I'm looking to facilitate that. I mean, one of the things what Village is doing, we're not saying we need to own every community operation. We're saying, how do we provide people with the tools and the playbooks and the capabilities such that people in those communities, journalistic entrepreneurs in those communities, can do that without having to have a lot of resources to build all the tools and capabilities and figure out how to sell ads in this environment and so on and so forth. But thank you. It's a good question, really good question. One more, just one more.
Hi, my name is Claire Wang. My question is, in this obviously very polarized world, it's clear that many people will gravitate towards a partisan news source that just makes them feel better. So how, do you think that you can build a loyal group, like consumer base for a nonpartisan group?
I mean, again, it's a hard problem because you cite, you know, confirmation, as I pointed out elsewhere, confirmation bias, we look at that as an affliction that others have. And in truth, it's in all of us, right? I mean, it's basically this. It's a survival instinct. I will trust what I know versus accept information that I'm less familiar with. But to your point, I think it's in several ways, as I've talked about, in several ways, including how do we cover stories such that we're not simply being seen as partisan on the other side? That's why I like the community level, because at the community level, you can approach the community on so many more subjects that aren't divisive, that aren't controversial, and can you build community there, right? Again, there was that fascinating Stanford study that said, address non-controversial topics to knit the community together and build the trust to deal with the harder ones. That's much more difficult in national media today, because national media today is almost entirely political content, which obviously makes it ever more challenged. But I would love to see, and Mark Thompson at CNN is trying to go in this direction, is can he stand in the middle and not simply drift partisan? Now, it's hard from a business model perspective, because what CNN learned 40 years ago was that it's much easier to put up a whole lot of opinion content, people shouting at each other, people demonizing the other, to attach to a particular audience. But we need to break out of that. And if we don't break out of that, I fear going forward. I'll close with this. And sometimes I think it's hard. I even said to Jennifer before today, I said, given the state of the world and the state of our country, which is so challenged, I said, I feel like my talk is about suggesting we buy new deck chairs for the Titanic while it's sinking. But we have to do that. We have to make sure, first of all, that the Titanic doesn't sink. But we can't simply assume that there's nothing we can do about our own efforts to address these challenges in our society. And we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our families and our communities and our societies to try as best we can to do that.
Thank you.
I thank you very much.